Okay, so now let's separate this fraction around the subtraction in that numerator. So I'm carrying this along, and I'd have this y over that y squared. Well, that just gives me a 1 over a y, right? Okay, so let's go slow here and make sure we see what we've got. Negative xy prime over y squared, nothing cancels. So I get a negative xy over y squared times y prime. And then over here, I'm just going to simplify this. So I get 6 pi squared x squared, and I get plus 6e to the negative y prime. Okay, so let's scope out where the y prime guys are, here and here. This one is still nested inside, so I must take the time to multiply it out. So I'm going to distribute, and then this times this, right? So I get negative 1 over y, sine of x over y, and then this two negatives make a positive, x over y squared, sine of x over y prime, and then I'm just going to change colors to come back over to this other side, plus 6e to the negative y prime. Okay, so now scoping out the y prime terms, right? Because I want to isolate those. That would be these two terms. So you can choose either side. So I'm just going to choose to move them over or keep them on the left-hand side. So I'll keep this here, x squared, y squared, sine of x over y prime. So I'll subtract this over. And then I'll keep this one here. And then I'll add this one over. Okay, so then you know the next step is to factor out the y prime. So let me just do it up here. So my screen's still not cooperating so much. So I want, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to take this side and I'm going to factor a y prime out. So I have x squared over y squared sine of xy minus 6e to the negative y, right? Because I took those two y prime guys out. The right-hand side just carries along for the ride. So I'll just keep it in the same color so you see it. Over y sine of x over y. So to finally finish solving for y prime, I just take this side here, this 6 pi squared x squared plus 1 over y sine of x over y, and then I divide it by this, right? X squared y squared sine of x over y. Can you think of a more ugly answer? I don't think I could.